Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight we'll explore one of America's most captivating true crime cases. This is the story of a young woman's disappearance that would grip the nation and uncover a web of deception that shocked everyone who thought they knew the truth. In the quiet suburbs of Modesto, California, Christmas Eve 2002 began like any other winter morning. The sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns of the middle-class neighborhood, where families were preparing for holiday celebrations. But in one house on Covina Avenue, something was terribly wrong. Lacey Peterson should have been the picture of happiness that December morning. At 27 years old, she was 8 months pregnant with her first child, a son they had already named Connor. She had that radiant glow that people often speak of when describing expectant mothers, her dark hair framing a face that seemed to light up every room she entered. Those who knew Lacey described her as vivacious, caring, and deeply excited about becoming a mother. Her husband Scott Peterson seemed, to many, like the ideal partner. At 30 years old, he was handsome in that all-American way, with sandy blonde hair and a charming smile that had won over Lacey's heart years earlier. They had met in 1994 at a cafe in San Luis Obispo, where both were students at Cal Poly. Scott was studying agricultural business, while Lacey pursued ornamental horticulture. Their romance blossomed quickly, and they married in 1997 in a ceremony that friends described as magical. By 2002, they had built what appeared to be a perfect life together. Scott worked as a fertilizer salesman, a job that required him to travel throughout California's Central Valley. Lacey had worked at a pruning company but had recently left to prepare for motherhood and focus on decorating the nursery for baby Connor. They had purchased their home in Modesto, not far from Lacey's mother Sharon Rocha, and seemed to be living the American dream. But beneath this veneer of suburban perfection, cracks were beginning to show. Those closest to the couple would later reveal that Scott had become increasingly distant as Lacey's pregnancy progressed. While she threw herself into preparing for their son's arrival, buying baby clothes and setting up the nursery with meticulous care, Scott seemed to be pulling away from the reality of impending fatherhood. On the morning of December 24, 2002, Scott Peterson claimed he kissed his pregnant wife goodbye and left their home to go fishing at Berkeley Marina, about 90 miles away. He said Lacey was planning to walk their golden retriever, Mackenzie, then visit her mother Sharon's beauty salon before returning home to prepare for Christmas Eve dinner with her family. But Lacey never arrived at the salon. She never called. She simply vanished. When Sharon Rocha couldn't reach her daughter by phone that afternoon, a creeping sense of dread began to settle in. Lacey was the type of person who always stayed in touch, especially during the holidays and especially being so close to her due date. Sharon knew something was wrong. Scott returned from his fishing trip around 4:30 that afternoon to find the house empty except for Mackenzie, who was in the backyard with his leash still on. The dog appeared muddy and agitated, as if he had been searching for something or someone. Scott claimed he wasn't immediately worried, thinking perhaps Lacey had lost track of time shopping or visiting with family. But as the hours passed and Lacey failed to return home or answer her cell phone, Scott finally called Sharon Rocha around 5:15 p.m. "Is Lacey there?" he asked. When Sharon said no, Scott explained that Lacey wasn't home and he was starting to get concerned. Together, they began calling hospitals, friends, and family members, hoping to find some trace of the young woman. By 6 p.m., Scott and Lacey's stepfather Ron Gransky contacted the Modesto Police Department to report Lacey missing. The responding officer, Sergeant Ed Steele, arrived at the Peterson home to take the report. What he found was a house that appeared normal, perhaps even unusually tidy for a family preparing for Christmas. There were no signs of struggle, no indication of forced entry, nothing to suggest violence had occurred within those walls. But there were details that would later seem significant. The couple's cat was outside, which was unusual since it was typically kept indoors. Lacey's purse was still in the house, along with her keys and identification. Her cell phone was plugged in and charging in the bedroom. For a woman who was 8 months pregnant and rarely went anywhere without staying in constant contact with family, this was concerning. Scott's behavior during that initial police interview was noted by officers as somewhat odd. He seemed calm, almost detached, as he described his wife's disappearance. While family members were becoming increasingly frantic with worry, Scott maintained an eerily composed demeanor that struck some as inappropriate for a man whose pregnant wife had vanished without a trace. Word of Lacey's disappearance spread quickly through Modesto's tight-knit community. Within hours, volunteers began gathering to organize search parties. Lacey's family, led by her mother Sharon and stepfather Ron, threw themselves into the effort with desperate determination. They printed thousands of flyers bearing Lacey's photograph and distributed them throughout the city and surrounding areas. The searches were massive, involving hundreds of volunteers who combed through parks, neighborhoods, shopping centers, and rural areas around Modesto. They searched along the Tuolumne River, through East La Loma Park where Lacey often walked Mackenzie, and in every conceivable place where she might have gone or been taken. Scott participated in some of these searches, but his involvement was sporadic and half-hearted according to many volunteers. While Lacey's family was out from dawn to dusk, posting flyers and coordinating search efforts, Scott often seemed distracted or absent. When he did appear at volunteer headquarters, he was frequently on his cell phone, taking calls that he claimed were work-related. The Modesto Police Department launched their own intensive investigation, treating the case as a missing person inquiry initially, though the unusual circumstances had detectives concerned from the beginning. Detective Alan Brocchini was assigned as the lead investigator, and he began methodically examining every aspect of Lacey's life and disappearance. One of the first things that caught investigators' attention was Scott's fishing story. He claimed to have driven 90 miles to Berkeley Marina on Christmas Eve morning to fish for sturgeon in the San Francisco Bay. This struck many as odd for several reasons. Scott was not an avid fisherman, and those who knew him couldn't recall him ever fishing alone or traveling such a distance for the activity. Moreover, Christmas Eve seemed like an unusual day to leave one's heavily pregnant wife to go fishing alone. When detectives examined Scott's truck and boat, they found his fishing equipment appeared almost unused. The lures were pristine, showing no signs of having been in the water. There was no bait in the boat, no fish, no evidence that any actual fishing had taken place. Scott's explanation was that the water was too choppy and he decided not to fish after all, but this raised more questions than it answered. As days turned into weeks without any sign of Lacey, the case began attracting national media attention. The story had all the elements that captivate the public: a beautiful young woman, a pregnancy, a husband whose story didn't quite add up, and the haunting mystery of what could have happened to this seemingly perfect family. Nancy Grace, Greta Van Susteren, and other cable news personalities began covering the case nightly. The Modesto Bee provided extensive local coverage, and soon news crews from across the country descended on the small Central Valley city. The case became a national obsession, with viewers following every development and debating Scott's innocence or guilt in online forums and coffee shops across America. Scott's behavior during this media circus was closely scrutinized. While Lacey's family made emotional pleas for her safe return, often breaking down in tears during press conferences, Scott maintained an almost robotic composure. When he did speak to reporters, his words seemed carefully chosen and lacking in genuine emotion. He rarely referred to Lacey by name, instead calling her "my wife," and he seemed more concerned with defending himself against growing suspicion than with appealing for help finding his missing family. During one particularly telling television interview, Scott was asked to speak directly to whoever might have taken Lacey. His response was wooden and unconvincing: "Please, please, let her go. Let her come back to us." The words were right, but the delivery lacked the raw desperation that people expected from a man whose pregnant wife had vanished. As the investigation continued into January 2003, detectives were methodically examining every aspect of Scott's life, looking for anything that might explain what had happened to Lacey. They analyzed his computer, his phone records, his financial statements, and his work schedule. What they discovered would shatter the image of the perfect marriage that Scott had been presenting to the world. On December 30, 2002, just 6 days after Lacey's disappearance, a woman named Amber Fry contacted the Modesto Police Department with information that would change everything. Amber was a 28-year-old massage therapist and single mother living in Fresno. She had been dating Scott Peterson. The revelation of Scott's affair sent shockwaves through the investigation and the public following the case. Here was a man who appeared on television pleading for his wife's safe return, all while carrying on a romantic relationship with another woman. But the most damning aspect of the affair wasn't just its existence, it was the timeline and the lies Scott had told. Amber revealed that she had met Scott on November 20, 2002, just over a month before Lacey disappeared. They had been introduced by a mutual friend who thought they would be a good match. Scott told Amber he was single and had never been married. Their relationship quickly became intimate, and Scott seemed to be pursuing her seriously, talking about a future together and even meeting her young daughter. But there was something even more chilling about Scott's deception. On December 9, 2002, 15 days before Lacey would disappear, Scott told Amber that he had lost his wife, and that this would be his first Christmas without her. He claimed he was traveling to Europe for the holidays to cope with his grief. Amber, believing Scott was a widower, felt sorry for him and tried to comfort him through what she thought was his difficult first holiday season without his deceased spouse. The implications of this lie were staggering. 2 weeks before Lacey Peterson disappeared, Scott was already telling people she was gone. It suggested a level of premeditation that investigators found deeply disturbing. Working with the police, Amber Fry agreed to secretly record her phone conversations with Scott Peterson. These recordings would become some of the most damaging evidence in the case, revealing a man who was coldly manipulative and apparently unconcerned about his missing pregnant wife. In one particularly chilling call recorded on December 31, 2002, while massive search efforts were underway for Lacey, Scott called Amber from what he claimed was a New Year's Eve party in Paris. He described champagne and celebration, painting a picture of himself living it up in Europe while his wife and unborn child remained missing. In reality, Scott was at a candlelight vigil for Lacey in Modesto, surrounded by hundreds of people praying for her safe return. The conversations revealed Scott to be an accomplished liar, capable of maintaining elaborate deceptions while showing no apparent remorse or concern for his family. When Amber would ask about his wife, Scott would sometimes become emotional, but investigators believed this was performance rather than genuine grief. In another recorded call, Amber confronted Scott about lying to her regarding his marital status. Scott's response was telling. Rather than showing remorse or explaining his actions, he became defensive and tried to manipulate Amber into feeling sorry for him. He claimed he had wanted to tell her the truth but hadn't known how. These recordings painted a picture of a man who was far more concerned with maintaining his relationship with his mistress than with finding his missing wife. They suggested someone who was planning a future without Lacey long before she disappeared. For months, the case remained a mystery. Despite massive search efforts, extensive investigation, and national media coverage, there was no trace of Lacey Peterson or her unborn son. The lack of physical evidence made it difficult for prosecutors to move forward with charges, even as public suspicion of Scott Peterson continued to grow. Then, on April 13, 2003, nearly 4 months after Lacey's disappearance, a grisly discovery was made along the shores of San Francisco Bay. A couple walking their dog in Point Isabel Regional Shoreline in Richmond, California, found the body of a male fetus that had washed ashore. The remains were severely decomposed, but investigators suspected this might be Connor Peterson. The next day, April 14, 2003, another dog walker discovered the badly decomposed remains of a woman about a mile from where the fetus had been found. The body was missing its head and limbs, likely due to decomposition and marine life activity during the months it had been in the water. But investigators believed these were the remains of Laci Peterson. The location of the bodies was significant and deeply troubling for Scott Peterson. The remains were found in San Francisco Bay, not far from Berkeley Marina, where Scott claimed to have gone fishing on the day Laci disappeared. This was exactly the area where investigators had suspected Scott might have disposed of his wife's body, but they had been unable to search the vast waters effectively. DNA testing confirmed what investigators had suspected: the remains were those of Laci Peterson and her unborn son Connor. The discovery of the bodies provided the physical evidence that prosecutors needed to move forward with murder charges. On April 18, 2003, Scott Peterson was arrested in La Jolla, California, near the Mexican border. The circumstances of his arrest raised even more questions about his behavior and potential guilt. Scott had dyed his blonde hair reddish-brown and grown a goatee, significantly altering his appearance. He was carrying $15,000 in cash, multiple cell phones, camping equipment, and his brother's identification. When detectives searched Scott's vehicle, they found what appeared to be a survival kit, knives, rope, a shovel, duct tape, and other items that suggested he might have been planning to flee the country. Scott's family would later claim he was simply going camping and golfing in San Diego, but investigators believed he was attempting to escape to Mexico before he could be charged with murder. The arrest brought a sense of closure to Laci's family, who had endured months of uncertainty and growing suspicion about Scott's involvement in her disappearance. Sharon Rocha, Laci's mother, had initially supported Scott and believed in his innocence, but as more evidence emerged about his affair and behavior, she had begun to have doubts. Scott Peterson was charged with 2 counts of murder: first-degree murder in the death of Laci and second-degree murder in the death of Connor. The different charges reflected prosecutors' theory that Laci was the intended victim, while Connor's death was a consequence of the attack on his mother. Scott Peterson's trial began in June 2004 in Redwood City, California. The case had generated so much publicity in Modesto that the judge granted a change of venue to ensure Scott could receive a fair trial. The proceedings were closely watched by media and the public, with every day of testimony analyzed and debated by legal experts and crime enthusiasts. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Rick DeStaso, presented their case methodically. They argued that Scott Peterson had murdered his wife because he wanted to escape the responsibilities of marriage and fatherhood to pursue his relationship with Amber Frey. They pointed to his lies, his strange behavior after Laci's disappearance, his affair, and the fact that the bodies were found near where he claimed to have been fishing as evidence of his guilt. The prosecution presented the recorded phone calls between Scott and Amber Frey, which were devastating to his defense. Jurors heard Scott lying repeatedly, showing no genuine concern for his missing wife, and painting himself as a grieving widower weeks before Laci actually disappeared. The calls revealed a man who seemed more concerned with maintaining his deception than with finding his family. Amber Frey herself testified for the prosecution, describing her relationship with Scott and the lies he had told her. Her testimony was particularly powerful because she came across as a reluctant witness who had been deceived and manipulated by Scott. She had no apparent motive to lie, and her cooperation with police had been crucial in building the case against him. The defense, led by Mark Garagos, faced a difficult challenge. They had no alternative theory that could explain the evidence, and Scott's behavior was hard to defend. Instead, they focused on attacking the prosecution's case, arguing that all the evidence was circumstantial and that Scott was being prosecuted in the court of public opinion rather than on solid evidence. The defense suggested that Laci might have been killed by someone else, possibly in connection with a burglary in the neighborhood that occurred around the time of her disappearance. They argued that Scott's affair, while morally wrong, didn't make him a murderer. They claimed his strange behavior was the result of shock and poor judgment rather than guilt. After deliberating for 7 days, the jury reached their verdict on November 12, 2004. Scott Peterson was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Laci Peterson and second-degree murder in the death of Conner Peterson. The different verdicts reflected the jury's belief that Scott had planned and carried out Laci's murder, while Conner's death was a result of the attack on his mother. The guilty verdict was met with cheers and applause from the crowd gathered outside the courthouse. Laci's family wept with relief, finally having some measure of justice for their beloved daughter and grandson. Scott showed little emotion as the verdict was read, maintaining the same stoic demeanor he had displayed throughout the trial. During the penalty phase of the trial, the jury heard emotional testimony from Laci's family about the impact of her death. Sharon Rocha spoke about her daughter's excitement about becoming a mother and the dreams that had been stolen from both Laci and Conner. The testimony was heartbreaking and painted a picture of the vibrant life that had been cut short. The defense presented evidence about Scott's character and family background, hoping to convince the jury to spare his life. Family members testified about Scott's good qualities and pleaded for mercy. However, the jury was unmoved by these appeals. On March 16, 2005, Scott Peterson was sentenced to death by lethal injection. The judge called the murders cruel, uncaring, heartless, and callous, and said Scott had shown no remorse for his actions. Scott was sent to San Quentin State Prison to await execution. Scott Peterson's case didn't end with his conviction and death sentence. His defense team immediately began filing appeals, claiming that errors during the trial had prevented Scott from receiving a fair hearing. They argued that the extensive media coverage had prejudiced potential jurors and that the prosecution had failed to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The appeals process dragged on for years, with various courts reviewing different aspects of the case. Scott's lawyers raised numerous issues, including claims of ineffective counsel, prosecutorial misconduct, and jury bias. They argued that the circumstantial nature of the evidence was insufficient to support a death sentence. In 2020, nearly 16 years after Scott's conviction, the California Supreme Court overturned his death sentence. The court found that potential jurors who opposed the death penalty had been improperly dismissed during jury selection, which could have biased the panel toward imposing a death sentence. However, the court upheld Scott's murder convictions, finding that there was sufficient evidence to support his guilt. Following the overturning of his death sentence, Scott Peterson was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole in December 2021. This meant he would spend the rest of his life behind bars, but would no longer face execution for his crimes. In a surprising development, the Los Angeles Innocence Project announced in 2024 that they were representing Scott Peterson and investigating his case. The Innocence Project typically takes on cases where there is strong evidence that someone has been wrongfully convicted, often through DNA evidence or other scientific advances. The organization's involvement has raised questions about whether there might be evidence that could exonerate Scott Peterson or point to another perpetrator. However, they have not released specific details about what new evidence or arguments they might present. Their investigation is ongoing, and it remains to be seen whether it will result in any changes to Scott's conviction. The Innocence Project's involvement has been controversial, given the extensive evidence that was presented against Scott Peterson during his original trial. Many legal experts remain skeptical that the organization will be able to overturn such a high-profile conviction that was based on extensive circumstantial evidence. The Laci Peterson case had a profound impact on American culture and the criminal justice system. It demonstrated the power of media coverage in shaping public opinion about criminal cases, both positively and negatively. The extensive coverage helped keep pressure on law enforcement to solve the case, but it also raised questions about whether Scott Peterson could receive a fair trial given the overwhelming publicity. The case also highlighted issues around domestic violence and the particular vulnerability of pregnant women. Statistics show that homicide is a leading cause of death for pregnant women, and the Peterson case brought national attention to this disturbing reality. Lacey's Law, passed by Congress in 2004, made it a federal crime to harm or kill an unborn child during the commission of certain federal crimes. For Lacey's family, the case brought justice but also lasting trauma. Sharon Rocha became an advocate for victims' rights and has spoken about the impact of losing her daughter and grandson. The family has worked to keep Lacey's memory alive while also trying to move forward with their lives. The case continues to fascinate true crime enthusiasts and legal experts more than 20 years after Lacey's disappearance. New documentaries and books about the case are still being produced, examining different aspects of the investigation and trial. The recent involvement of the Innocence Project has renewed interest in the case and raised new questions about Scott Peterson's guilt or innocence. Despite Scott Peterson's conviction and the extensive investigation that preceded it, some questions about the case remain unanswered. The prosecution presented a strong circumstantial case, but they were never able to definitively prove how, when, or where Lacey Peterson was killed. The lack of a clear murder scene has always been a weakness in the case. While prosecutors theorized that Scott killed Lacey in their home, no physical evidence was found to support this theory. There was no blood, no signs of struggle, no forensic evidence that a murder had taken place in the Peterson house. This has led some to question whether the crime occurred elsewhere or was committed by someone else entirely. The murder weapon was never found, and the exact cause of Lacey's death couldn't be determined due to the condition of her remains when they were discovered. This has left room for alternative theories about what might have happened to her. Some have questioned whether Scott Peterson had the physical capability to move Lacey's body, especially given her advanced pregnancy. At 8 months pregnant, Lacey would have weighed significantly more than usual, and moving her body would have been challenging for Scott, who was not particularly large or strong. The timeline of events on December 24, 2002, has also been scrutinized. Scott claimed to have left for his fishing trip in the morning, but the exact time has never been definitively established. Some witnesses reported seeing Lacey walking her dog that morning after Scott claimed to have left, which would complicate the prosecution's theory of the case. The Scott Peterson case has been analyzed extensively by criminal psychologists and behavioral experts who have tried to understand what might drive someone to commit such a crime. The case presents several psychological elements that are common in domestic homicides but were particularly stark in Peterson's behavior. Scott's ability to lie convincingly and maintain multiple deceptions simultaneously suggested to experts that he possessed significant narcissistic traits. His relationship with Amber Frey, maintained through elaborate lies about his marital status, demonstrated a capacity for manipulation and self-serving behavior that concerned investigators. Perhaps most chilling was Scott's apparent lack of genuine emotion regarding his wife's disappearance. While family members were distraught and desperate, Scott maintained an almost robotic composure that struck many as inappropriate. This emotional detachment, combined with his continued pursuit of other relationships while his pregnant wife was missing, painted a picture of someone who lacked normal empathy and attachment. The case also highlighted the phenomenon of family annihilation, where individuals kill their spouse and children to escape family responsibilities or pursue other relationships. Scott's behavior fit this pattern, suggesting he saw his family as obstacles to the life he wanted rather than as people he loved and cherished. Experts have noted that Scott's crime, if he committed it, required significant planning and premeditation. The location where the bodies were found, matching the area where Scott claimed to have been fishing, suggested careful thought about how to dispose of evidence. This level of planning is consistent with someone who is methodical and calculating rather than impulsive. The Peterson case became a cultural phenomenon that extended far beyond the typical true crime story. The case had elements that seemed to capture the American imagination: a seemingly perfect couple, a pregnancy, betrayal, and a mystery that unfolded in real time on television screens across the country. The extensive media coverage raised important questions about the relationship between journalism and justice. While the coverage helped maintain pressure on law enforcement to solve the case, it also created a circus-like atmosphere that may have compromised Scott Peterson's right to a fair trial. The defense argued that the pretrial publicity made it impossible for Scott to receive an impartial hearing, a concern that resonates in our current media environment. Social media, though not as prominent in 2002 to 2004 as it is today, still played a role in the case through online forums and chat rooms where people debated Scott's guilt or innocence. These discussions often became heated and emotional, reflecting the strong feelings the case evoked in the public. The case also demonstrated the power of visual media in shaping public opinion. The contrast between Scott's calm demeanor and Laci's family's obvious anguish was stark and influenced how many people perceived his guilt or innocence. Television coverage focused heavily on body language and facial expressions, with experts analyzing every gesture and expression for clues about Scott's state of mind. The murder of Laci Peterson remains one of the most significant criminal cases of the early 21st century, not just for its legal implications but for its cultural impact. The case demonstrated how modern media coverage could transform a local crime into a national obsession, influencing everything from legal proceedings to public policy. For those who followed the case closely, it served as a reminder that the most dangerous place for many women is their own home, and that domestic violence can lurk behind even the most seemingly perfect marriages. The case brought attention to the particular vulnerability of pregnant women and led to legislative changes designed to protect unborn children. The Peterson case also highlighted the challenges facing the criminal justice system in the modern media age. The extensive coverage, while helping to solve the case and bring attention to important issues, also raised questions about fair trial rights and the presumption of innocence that are fundamental to our legal system. More than 2 decades after Laci Peterson's disappearance, the case continues to generate discussion and debate. Scott Peterson maintains his innocence from his prison cell, and the recent involvement of the Los Angeles Innocence Project suggests that questions about the case may not be fully settled. Whether Scott Peterson is guilty or innocent, the case of Laci Peterson's murder changed how America thinks about domestic violence, media coverage of criminal cases, and the rights of unborn children. It remains a cautionary tale about the dangers that can lurk beneath the surface of seemingly perfect lives and the importance of believing victims and potential victims when they express fear or concern about their safety. The case serves as a reminder that justice, while often achieved, is never simple and that the search for truth in criminal cases can be complex and sometimes elusive. As new evidence or arguments are presented, as in the current Innocence Project investigation, it's important to remember that our justice system is designed to be thorough and deliberate, even when that means revisiting cases that seemed closed. For Laci Peterson and her son Connor, justice meant holding someone accountable for their deaths. Whether that justice was correctly applied remains a question that continues to haunt this tragic case and the family members who loved them both. And so ends the story of Laci Peterson, a young woman whose disappearance captivated a nation and whose case continues to raise questions about justice, truth, and the complexity of human nature. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we explore true crime stories in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. In the quiet rolling hills of Beach City, Ohio, nestled among sprawling farmland and century-old barns, stood a white farmhouse that once epitomized the American dream. To neighbors driving past on dusty country roads, the Stockdale family appeared to embody everything wholesome about rural life. The sounds of bluegrass music would drift across their property on warm summer evenings, accompanied by the gentle lowing of cattle and the rustle of corn stalks in the breeze. But sometimes, the most picturesque facades conceal the darkest secrets. And on June 15, 2017, the idyllic silence of that Ohio farmhouse would be shattered forever by gunshots that would transform a family's private struggles into a national tragedy. This is the story of the Stockdales, a family that invited America into their home through reality television, only to have their most devastating moments play out in the harsh light of public scrutiny. It's a story about control, isolation, and the dangerous pressure that builds when perfection becomes a prison. Timothy Stockdale believed in discipline. Not the casual kind of discipline that most parents practice, but the kind that shapes every waking moment of a child's existence. In his mind, the modern world had become too permissive, too chaotic, too corrupted by technology and liberal values. His solution was to create a sanctuary, a place where his 4 sons would be molded into the kind of men he believed society desperately needed. The Stockdale farmhouse became more than a home, it became a self-contained universe with its own rigid laws and unwavering hierarchy. Timothy, a stern man with graying hair and penetrating eyes, ruled this domain alongside his wife Catherine, a soft-spoken woman who had long ago learned that harmony meant compliance with her husband's vision. Their 4 sons, Charles, Calvin, Jacob, and James, lived according to a schedule that would make military academies seem relaxed. Every day began before dawn with farm chores. The boys would stumble out of bed in the pre-dawn darkness, their breath forming small clouds in the chilly Ohio air as they made their way to the barn. Cattle needed feeding, stalls required mucking, and fence posts demanded inspection, all before most children their age had even opened their eyes. Education happened at the kitchen table, where Catherine would guide her sons through carefully selected curriculum that emphasized traditional values and biblical teachings. There were no debates about evolution, no discussions of alternative viewpoints, no questioning of established authority. Knowledge was presented as absolute, and curiosity beyond approved boundaries was gently but firmly discouraged. But it was the music that truly defined the Stockdale family's public identity. Timothy had recognized early that his sons possessed natural musical talent, and he channeled this gift into something that could showcase their family's values to the world. The Stockdale family band became their calling card, for boys with identical haircuts, wearing matching outfits, performing bluegrass and gospel music with remarkable skill. They played at county fairs, church gatherings, and local festivals. Audiences would watch in amazement as these young musicians, some barely teenagers, would play complex harmonies and intricate instrumental solos with the precision of seasoned professionals. The youngest, James, could make a fiddle sing with the kind of emotional depth that seemed impossible for someone his age. But what the audiences didn't see were the hours of mandatory practice that preceded these performances. In the Stockdale house, music wasn't just a hobby or even a passion, it was an obligation. The boys would spend hours each day perfecting their craft, not because they loved it, but because their father demanded excellence. Mistakes weren't learning opportunities, they were failures that required correction. The outside world saw discipline and talent. They saw a family that had rejected the chaos of modern life in favor of something pure and timeless. Local newspapers would write glowing articles about the Stockdale boys, praising their musical abilities and their respectful demeanor. Church leaders would hold them up as examples of what proper child rearing could accomplish. But within the walls of that farmhouse, a different story was unfolding. The boys learned early that their individual desires, their personal dreams, their private thoughts were secondary to the family image. They were not encouraged to develop friendships outside the family circle. They had no exposure to the cultural touchstones that defined their generation, no video games, no popular music, no casual interactions with peers who might introduce different ideas or perspectives. Jacob, the 3rd son, seemed particularly affected by this isolation. While his brothers found ways to adapt to their father's expectations, Jacob often appeared lost in thought, his dark eyes holding a sadness that seemed too profound for someone so young. He was intelligent and musically gifted, but there was something restless about him, something that suggested he was always looking beyond the boundaries of their carefully controlled world. Neighbors occasionally wondered about the Stockdale boys. They were polite when encountered in town, almost unnaturally so. They spoke in measured tones, never raised their voices, never displayed the casual rebelliousness that most teenagers exhibited. Some found this admirable, others found it slightly unsettling. But these were merely whispers, casual observations made by people who only saw the Stockdales from a distance. The family had successfully crafted an image of wholesome perfection that served as an impenetrable shield against outside scrutiny. They were the family that other families aspired to emulate, the living proof that traditional values could still triumph in a changing world. This carefully constructed image would soon attract attention from an unexpected source: television producers who specialized in finding families willing to expose their private lives to public examination. They were looking for families that represented specific lifestyles, families that could serve as compelling contrasts to each other in the name of entertainment. The Stockdales, with their strict rules and old-fashioned values, seemed perfect for their purposes. The call came on an ordinary Tuesday morning in 2008. During a 2008 episode of the show Wife Swap, two starkly different families were presented. Producers from ABC's Wife Swap had somehow learned about the Stockdale family and their unique lifestyle. They were interested, they explained, in featuring a family that represented traditional American values, a family that could serve as a compelling contrast to more liberal, modern families. Timothy Stockdale saw an opportunity. Here was a chance to showcase their way of life on a national stage, to demonstrate to millions of Americans that their approach to family life wasn't just viable, but superior. He imagined families across the country watching his sons and recognizing the benefits of discipline and structure. Perhaps some parents would even be inspired to implement similar rules in their own homes. The concept of wife swap was simple but potentially explosive. Two families with dramatically different lifestyles would exchange mothers for 2 weeks. The visiting mother would first live according to the host family's existing rules, then spend the second week implementing her own rules and values. The resulting culture clash was designed to create compelling television while theoretically offering each family insights into alternative ways of living. For the Stockdales, this represented both an opportunity and a risk. Timothy was confident that their lifestyle would prove superior under scrutiny. Their boys were well-behaved, talented, and accomplished. Their home was orderly and peaceful. Their values were solid and unshakable. What could go wrong? The family they were paired with couldn't have been more different. The Tonkovic family from Illinois represented everything the Stockdales had rejected about modern life. The mother, Lori Tonkovic, was outgoing and permissive. Her children had considerable freedom to make their own choices about everything from clothing to entertainment to social activities. Their home was casual, noisy, and filled with the kind of electronic devices that were banned from the Stockdale farmhouse. When the cameras arrived at the Stockdale farm, they captured exactly what the producers had hoped for, a family that seemed to exist in a different century. The boys performed their musical arrangements with impressive skill, their voices blending in perfect harmony as they stood in formation, instruments held with military precision. They demonstrated their farm chores with quiet efficiency, never complaining about the early hours or the physical demands of their responsibilities. Timothy spoke directly to the camera about his philosophy of child rearing. He explained that children needed clear boundaries and consistent expectations. He talked about the importance of hard work, respect for authority, and dedication to family values. His words carried the weight of absolute conviction. This wasn't just one approach to parenting, it was the correct approach. But the cameras also captured subtler moments. They caught the way the boys glanced at each other when their father wasn't looking, brief expressions that suggested unspoken communication. They filmed Jacob staring out windows with a distant expression, as if he were imagining himself somewhere else entirely. When Lori Tonkovic arrived to take Catherine's place, the culture clash was immediate and dramatic. She was appalled by the rigidity of the family schedule, the lack of personal freedom granted to the boys, and the absolute authority wielded by Timothy. The boys, meanwhile, were fascinated by this outsider who spoke to them as individuals rather than components of a family unit. During her first week, Lori followed the Stockdale rules, but her discomfort was obvious. She struggled with the early morning routine, found the homeschooling restrictive, and was troubled by the boys' lack of independence. But it was during the second week, when she was allowed to implement her own rules, that the real drama unfolded. Laurie's rules were revolutionary by Stockdale standards. The boys were allowed to sleep until they naturally woke up. They could choose their own activities during free time. Most shocking of all, she introduced them to television, video games, and popular music, the very influences Timothy had worked so hard to keep out of his home. The boys' reactions were mixed but telling. Some embraced these new freedoms with obvious delight, staying up late to watch movies and play games. Others seemed overwhelmed by the sudden absence of structure, uncertain how to navigate a world where they were expected to make their own choices. Jacob's reaction was particularly intense. He seemed simultaneously thrilled and terrified by these glimpses of the outside world. He asked Laurie countless questions about life beyond the farm, about teenagers his age and other families, about possibilities he had never been allowed to consider. Timothy watched his carefully constructed world being dismantled before his eyes, and his response was swift and uncompromising. He argued with Laurie about every change she implemented, insisting that she was corrupting his sons and undermining years of careful moral instruction. The confrontations were heated and personal, with Timothy becoming increasingly agitated as his authority was challenged. The climax came during the family meeting at the end of the 2 weeks, a segment that became one of the most uncomfortable moments in wife swap history. Timothy's anger had reached a boiling point. He accused Laurie of trying to destroy his family, of introducing his sons to influences that would corrupt their character and derail their futures. His voice shook with rage as he defended his methods and condemned her interference. But even more telling than Timothy's anger was the boys' behavior during this confrontation. They sat in uncomfortable silence, their eyes downcast, as their father raged about protecting them from outside influences. Jacob, in particular, seemed to shrink into himself, as if he were trying to disappear entirely. When the cameras finally stopped rolling and the Tankovic family returned to Illinois, the Stockdale house fell back into its familiar patterns. The television was removed, the video games were packed away, and the boys returned to their rigid schedule of chores, practice, and homeschooling. But something had changed. The boys had tasted freedom, had glimpsed alternative ways of living, and these experiences couldn't be simply erased. The episode aired several months later to significant viewer reaction. Some praised the Stockdale family's commitment to traditional values and criticized Laurie Tankovic for interfering with their lifestyle. Others were disturbed by what they saw as excessive control and isolation of the children. The family received both fan mail and criticism, but Timothy remained convinced that they had successfully demonstrated the superiority of their approach. What Timothy didn't realize was that the damage had already been done. The seeds of doubt had been planted in his sons' minds, and over the following years, these seeds would grow into questions that would ultimately prove impossible to answer within the confines of their carefully controlled world. The Stockdale family had achieved their goal of national recognition, but fame, as they would learn, comes with consequences that can't always be controlled or contained. The years following their television appearance passed quietly on the Stockdale farm, but beneath the surface, tensions were building like pressure in a sealed container. The episode had been broadcast, discussed, and eventually forgotten by most viewers, but its impact on the family continued to reverberate through their daily lives. Timothy had expected that their national exposure would validate his parenting methods and perhaps even inspire other families to adopt similar approaches. Instead, he found himself defending his choices to people who had watched the show and formed their own opinions about his family. Some community members who had previously admired the Stockdales now looked at them with a mixture of curiosity and concern. The boys, meanwhile, were grappling with new awareness of just how different their lives were from those of their peers. The brief glimpse of freedom they had experienced during the show's filming had awakened longings they struggled to understand or express. They had seen that other families operated differently, that children their age had choices and freedoms that had never been part of their reality. Jacob, in particular, seemed changed. Always the most introspective of the four brothers, he became increasingly withdrawn and moody. His musical performances maintained their technical excellence, but something had gone out of them, a spark of enthusiasm that had been replaced by mechanical precision. He would sometimes stop mid-practice and stare out the window, his hands still positioned on his instrument but his mind clearly elsewhere. The farm work continued as always, the cattle still needed tending, the crops still required attention, and the family band still practiced every day. But observers who knew the family well began to notice subtle changes. The boys seemed less spontaneous in their interactions with each other, more guarded in their responses to adult questions, more careful about expressing any opinions that might be construed as criticism of their father's methods. Timothy, sensing these undercurrents of discontent, responded by tightening rather than loosening his control. Rules that had once been implicit became explicitly stated. Punishments for infractions became more severe. The boys' schedules became even more regimented, with less time for personal reflection or private activities. But the harder Timothy tried to maintain control, the more his sons seemed to slip away from him emotionally. Charles, the eldest, began talking about leaving home as soon as he came of age. Calvin showed signs of depression that worried even his emotionally distant father. James, the youngest, still seemed most comfortable within the family structure, but even he began asking questions about why their family was so different from others. Jacob's questions were more troubling because they cut to the heart of Timothy's philosophy. He wondered aloud why they couldn't have friends outside the family. He asked about attending public school, about learning to drive, about pursuing interests beyond music and farm work. Each question felt like a challenge to Timothy's authority, and his responses became increasingly defensive and absolute. The breaking point came when Jacob was 19. He had been talking more frequently about wanting to experience life beyond the farm, about seeing what the world outside their insular community had to offer. These conversations invariably ended in arguments with his father, heated exchanges that left both men frustrated and angry. One evening, after a particularly intense confrontation about Jacob's future, Timothy laid down an ultimatum: Jacob could live according to the family rules, or he could leave. There would be no middle ground, no gradual transition to independence, no negotiation about which rules might be relaxed as he matured. The choice was binary: complete compliance or exile. Jacob chose to leave. His departure sent shockwaves through the family. This wasn't supposed to happen. The Stockdale boys were supposed to be grateful for their upbringing, appreciative of the values they had been taught, eager to carry on the family traditions. Jacob's decision to walk away from everything Timothy had built felt like a personal betrayal and a rejection of everything the family stood for. For several years, Jacob lived independently, working various jobs and trying to navigate a world for which his sheltered upbringing had left him woefully unprepared. He struggled with basic social interactions, had difficulty maintaining relationships, and often felt overwhelmed by choices that seemed simple to others but felt impossibly complex to someone who had never been allowed to make his own decisions. But independence also brought Jacob experiences that had been denied to him throughout his childhood and adolescence. He discovered music beyond the bluegrass and gospel that had defined his youth. He met people from different backgrounds and cultures. He began to understand the vast range of human experience that existed beyond the boundaries of his father's carefully controlled world. However, the skills needed for independent living had never been part of Jacob's education. He had been trained to be an obedient son and a skilled musician, not a self-sufficient adult. He struggled financially, emotionally, and socially. The outside world that had seemed so appealing from the confines of the farm proved to be challenging and often hostile to someone lacking the social skills and cultural knowledge that most people acquire gradually throughout their childhood and adolescence. During this period, Jacob would occasionally return home for brief visits. These reunions were tense affairs, with Timothy hoping that his son's difficulties in the outside world would convince him to return permanently, and Jacob torn between his desire for independence and his need for the security and familiarity of home. The rest of the family watched these dynamics with growing concern. Catherine, who had always deferred to her husband's judgment, began to privately question whether their approach to child-rearing had been entirely wise. The other boys observed Jacob's struggles and began to wonder what their own futures might hold. Calvin, the second son, began showing signs of serious mental health issues. He became increasingly isolated, even within the already isolated family structure. His musical performances became erratic, and he sometimes disappeared for hours without explanation. Timothy attributed these problems to outside influences and tried to address them through increased supervision and stricter rules, but Calvin's condition continued to deteriorate. Charles, meanwhile, was approaching the age when he would need to make his own decision about staying or leaving. He watched Jacob's struggles with independence and wondered whether he would fare any better in the outside world. The prospect of staying forever under his father's control felt suffocating, but the example of Jacob's difficulties made independence seem equally daunting. James, still the youngest, seemed most content within the family structure, but even he began asking questions about why their family was so different from others. He had reached an age where he was becoming aware of the broader world, and the contrast between their lifestyle and that of other families was becoming increasingly apparent to him. The family's public image remained largely intact during this period. They continued to perform at local events, and those who saw them in public still perceived them as a disciplined, talented family unit. But those closest to them began to notice changes, a brittleness in their interactions, a forced quality to their smiles, a sense that they were performing their family harmony rather than living it. Jacob's periodic returns home became increasingly strained. He would arrive hoping for acceptance and understanding, but found instead a father who viewed his very presence as a threat to the family's stability. Timothy worried that Jacob's stories of life outside the farm would contaminate his other sons, encouraging them to question their situation and perhaps even to follow Jacob's example. These visits often ended in arguments, with Jacob feeling rejected and misunderstood, and Timothy feeling that his son had been irreversibly corrupted by outside influences. The rest of the family was caught in the middle, torn between loyalty to the family structure and sympathy for Jacob's obvious pain. As the years passed, it became increasingly clear that the Stockdale family was fragmenting. The unity that had once defined them was giving way to individual struggles and conflicting desires. The boys were growing into men with their own thoughts and ambitions, but they had no framework for expressing these individual identities within the rigid structure their father had created. The stage was being set for a tragedy that would shatter not only the family but also the community that had once held them up as an example of traditional values lived successfully. The pressures that had been building for years were approaching a breaking point, and when it finally came, the explosion would be devastating and irreversible. By 2017, the Stockdale family bore little resemblance to the unified, harmonious unit that had appeared on television nearly a decade earlier. The boys had grown into men, but their father's attempt to maintain childhood-level control over their lives had created a powder keg of resentment and frustration that was becoming impossible to contain. Jacob, now 25, had spent the previous 6 years cycling between independence and reluctant returns to the family farm. Each attempt at living on his own had ended in failure, not because he lacked intelligence or capability, but because his sheltered upbringing had left him without the social and practical skills necessary for navigating the modern world. His struggles with employment were particularly devastating. Jobs that required customer interaction exposed his inability to engage in the casual social exchanges that most people take for granted. His formal, stilted way of speaking, a product of years of being taught that every word should be carefully measured, made colleagues uncomfortable and supervisors uncertain about his social competence. Romantic relationships were even more challenging. Jacob had reached adulthood without ever having casual friendships with people his own age, let alone romantic relationships. The normal progression of childhood crushes, teenage dating, and young adult relationships had been entirely absent from his experience. When he tried to connect with women, his intensity and social awkwardness often frightened them away. Financial independence proved equally elusive. The skills that Jacob possessed, musical talent and farm work experience, were not easily monetized in the modern economy. He took various jobs in retail and food service, but his lack of familiarity with contemporary culture and technology made even these entry-level positions difficult to maintain. Each failure reinforced his father's narrative that the outside world was corrupt and dangerous, that the family farm was the only place where Jacob could find peace and security. but returning home meant accepting a level of control and supervision that felt increasingly intolerable to a man in his mid-20s. During his stays at home, Jacob would be subject to the same rules that had governed his childhood: early rising for farm chores, mandatory music practice, restrictions on his movements and activities, and complete deference to his father's authority. He was expected to contribute to the family band as if nothing had changed, performing the same songs with the same precision that had once brought him a measure of satisfaction but now felt like a prison. The other brothers watched these cycles with growing anxiety. Charles had finally mustered the courage to leave home permanently, but his departure had been marked by bitter arguments and threats from his father. Calvin's mental health had continued to deteriorate, and he was now displaying symptoms that clearly indicated the need for professional help that Timothy refused to seek, viewing mental health issues as character flaws rather than medical conditions. James, now 21, found himself in an increasingly impossible position. As the youngest, he had always been somewhat protected from the worst of his father's controlling behavior, but he was now old enough to understand the full implications of the family's dysfunction. He watched his brothers struggle and wondered whether his own future held anything but similar pain and confusion. Catherine, meanwhile, had become increasingly withdrawn. The woman who had once supported her husband's vision with quiet determination now seemed lost and uncertain. She watched her sons suffering and began to question whether their approach to child-rearing had been fundamentally flawed. But challenging Timothy's authority after decades of compliance felt impossible, and she found herself trapped between her maternal instincts and her learned patterns of submission. The community that had once admired the Stockdale family began to whisper about their troubles. Jacob's frequent returns home, always followed by dramatic departures, had not gone unnoticed. Charles's bitter exit from the family had generated gossip about what might really be happening behind the closed doors of the farmhouse. Calvin's increasingly erratic behavior at public events raised questions about his mental state. Timothy's response to these mounting pressures was to become even more rigid and controlling. He viewed each sign of independence or rebellion as a personal attack on his authority and the values he had worked so hard to instill. His sermons to his sons about the dangers of the outside world became more frequent and more intense. His rules became more detailed and more strictly enforced. But the harder Timothy tried to maintain control, the more his sons seemed to slip away from him. Jacob's visits home became shorter and more volatile. Calvin retreated further into his own troubled mind. James began asking increasingly pointed questions about why their family was so different from others, why they couldn't have normal relationships with people outside their immediate circle. The musical performances that had once been a source of family pride became forced and uncomfortable. The harmony that had once flowed naturally between the brothers now felt artificial and strained. Audiences who had known the family for years began to notice that something had changed, that the joy and authenticity that had once characterized their music had been replaced by mere technical competence. Jacob's mental state during this period was increasingly fragile. The constant cycle of failure and return, had worn away his sense of self-worth and hope for the future. He felt trapped between two impossible alternatives: a world he couldn't navigate successfully and a home where he couldn't breathe freely. His conversations with family members became increasingly dark and concerning. He talked about feeling like a failure, about wondering whether he would ever be able to live a normal life. He expressed anger toward his father for the way he had been raised, but also acknowledged his complete dependence on the family for basic survival. The isolation that had once been a source of family unity now felt like a curse. There were no outside perspectives, no neutral parties who might have provided counseling or mediation. The family's problems were contained within the farmhouse walls, festering and growing more toxic with each passing day. James, as the youngest and most vulnerable family member, found himself increasingly caught between his brother's resentment and his father's expectations. He loved his family but was beginning to understand that something was fundamentally wrong with their dynamic. He wanted to help Jacob but didn't know how. He wanted to please his father but was starting to question whether his father's vision of the world was accurate or healthy. The stage was set for a catastrophe that would destroy the family and shock the community that had once held them up as an example of traditional values successfully lived. The pressures that had been building for years were approaching a critical mass, and when the explosion finally came, it would be sudden, violent, and irreversible. In the weeks leading up to June 15, 2017, those who knew the family best would later recall sensing that something was deeply wrong. Jacob's behavior had become increasingly erratic, his mood swings more severe, his comments about his situation more desperate. But in a family that had always kept its problems private, these warning signs went unaddressed and unheeded. The tragedy that was about to unfold would serve as a devastating reminder that the most perfect-seeming facades can conceal the most profound dysfunction, and that the failure to address mental health issues and family trauma can have consequences that extend far beyond the individuals directly involved. June 15, 2017, began like any other day on the Stockdale farm. The summer sun rose over the familiar landscape of rolling hills and pastures, casting long shadows across the yard where the family had once played music together on countless peaceful evenings. The cattle stirred in their pastures, and the corn in the distant fields rustled softly in the morning breeze. Inside the white farmhouse, the family was beginning their daily routine. Timothy had risen early, as was his custom, to begin the farm chores that structured every day of their lives. Catherine was preparing breakfast in the kitchen where she had homeschooled her sons for so many years. James was getting ready to help with the morning tasks, still the most compliant of the brothers and the one who had adapted most successfully to the family's rigid expectations. Jacob had returned home several days earlier after another failed attempt at independent living. This cycle had become painfully familiar. Jacob would leave with hopes and determination, struggle with the challenges of the outside world, and eventually return home defeated and increasingly desperate. Each cycle left him more depressed, more angry, and more hopeless about his future. The conversations between Jacob and his father during this latest homecoming had been particularly heated. Timothy was growing impatient with his son's inability to either succeed independently or accept the family's rules without complaint. He had begun talking about making Jacob's situation more permanent. Either he would commit fully to the family's way of life, or he would need to leave permanently and never return. For Jacob, this ultimatum felt like a death sentence. He knew he couldn't survive successfully in the outside world, his repeated failures had proven that conclusively. But the thought of spending the rest of his life as a perpetual child, subject to his father's control and unable to make his own decisions, felt equally impossible. The morning of June 15, these tensions came to a head in a confrontation that neighbors later reported hearing from their own properties. Timothy and Jacob argued loudly about Jacob's future, about his responsibilities to the family, about his apparent ingratitude for everything he had been given. The argument escalated beyond the usual boundaries, with both men saying things that couldn't be taken back. James found himself caught in the middle of this confrontation, trying to mediate between his father and brother while struggling with his own growing doubts about the family's dysfunction. At 21, he was old enough to understand the complexity of their situation but still young enough to hope that somehow things could be resolved peacefully. What happened next would forever change the way the community viewed the Stockdale family and force a nation to confront uncomfortable questions about parenting, mental health, and the price of perfectionism. Jacob Stockdale fatally shot his mother and brother on June 15, 2017. Both family members died instantly from gunshot wounds to the head, and 25-year-old Jacob intended to then die by suicide. However, he ultimately survived after emergency responders rushed him to the hospital. The cops would later learn that 25-year-old Jacob had killed his 54-year-old mother, Catherine, and his younger brother, 21-year-old James. Jacob then turned the long gun on himself, inflicting a wound to his head but surviving. The gunshots shattered the rural quiet of Beach City, Ohio, at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon. Neighbors who heard the shots initially thought they might be related to farm work or hunting. Gunshots weren't uncommon in rural areas. But something about the rapid succession of shots and the silence that followed felt wrong to those who knew the family. When emergency responders arrived at the scene, they found a tragedy that would haunt them for years to come. James and Catherine were pronounced dead at the scene, but Jacob was still alive despite his self-inflicted wound. The paramedics worked frantically to stabilize him for transport to the hospital, not yet knowing the full scope of what had occurred. Timothy, who had been working in another part of the property when the shots were fired, returned to find his world completely destroyed. 2 of his sons were dead, another was critically injured and responsible for their deaths, and his wife, the quiet woman who had supported his vision for over 2 decades, was gone forever. The investigation that followed revealed the devastating culmination of years of mounting pressure and unaddressed mental health issues. Police interviews with Timothy and other family members painted a picture of a young man who had been struggling with severe depression, feelings of hopelessness, and a growing sense that he was trapped in an impossible situation with no viable solutions. Jacob's decision to take his own life after killing his mother and brother suggested that this was not a crime of passion but rather a planned attempt to escape what he perceived as an unbearable situation. The fact that he survived his suicide attempt would eventually provide investigators and mental health professionals with insights into the psychological factors that had led to this tragedy. Jacob was hospitalized and underwent multiple surgeries. Funerals for Kathy and James were held on June 24, 2017. The community that had once celebrated the Stockdale family as an example of traditional value successfully lived now struggled to make sense of how such a wholesome-appearing family could have harbored such darkness. The media attention was intense and immediate. The fact that the family had appeared on a popular reality television show added an element of public fascination to what was already a compelling tragedy. News outlets across the country picked up the story, and the 2008 wife swap episode was replayed and analyzed for clues about what might have gone wrong. Viewers who remembered the family from their television appearance were shocked by the contrast between the disciplined, harmonious family they had seen on screen and the devastating reality that had been unfolding behind closed doors. The episode, which had once seemed to showcase the benefits of strict parenting and traditional values, now looked like a documentation of a family in crisis. The surviving family members, Timothy and his 2 remaining sons, Charles and Calvin, were left to grapple with grief, guilt, and the complete destruction of everything they had believed about their family. The carefully constructed image of perfection had been shattered in the most public and devastating way possible. For Timothy, the tragedy represented the complete failure of everything he had worked to build. His vision of creating strong, disciplined sons who would carry on traditional values had instead produced a young man so desperate and hopeless that he saw murder and suicide as his only escape. The community that had once admired his parenting methods now looked at him with suspicion and pity. The farmhouse where the family had once made music together became a crime scene, marked by police tape and forever associated with violence rather than harmony. The instruments that had once brought the family together gathered dust as the survivors struggled to make sense of their new reality. The tragedy of June 15, 2017, marked the end of the Stockdale family as it had existed and the beginning of a painful process of legal proceedings, public scrutiny, and private grief that would continue for years to come. It served as a stark reminder that the most seemingly perfect families can conceal the most profound dysfunction, and that the failure to address mental health issues and family trauma can have consequences that extend far beyond the individuals directly involved. The weeks and months following the tragedy at the Stockdale farm were marked by a complex mixture of grief, legal proceedings, and public soul-searching that would continue for years. The community of Beach City, Ohio, struggled to reconcile the family they thought they knew with the devastating reality that had unfolded behind closed doors. Jacob Stockdale spent weeks in the hospital recovering from his self-inflicted gunshot wound. The bullet had caused significant damage, but doctors were able to save his life. As he slowly regained consciousness and began the long process of physical recovery, he also had to confront the magnitude of what he had done. The young man who had once stood on stages playing beautiful music with his family now faced the reality that he had destroyed that family forever. The legal system moved slowly but inexorably forward. Once Jacob was medically stable, he was charged with 2 counts of murder in the deaths of his mother and brother. The case garnered significant media attention, not only because of the family's previous television appearance but also because it raised uncomfortable questions about parenting, mental health, and the warning signs that communities might miss. Jacob's defense attorneys faced the challenging task of explaining their client's actions without excusing them. They painted a picture of a young man who had been raised in an environment so controlling and isolated that he had never developed the coping mechanisms necessary to deal with life's challenges. They argued that years of psychological pressure and untreated mental health issues had culminated in a tragic break from reality. The prosecution, meanwhile, focused on the deliberate nature of Jacob's actions. They argued that regardless of his upbringing or mental state, he had made a conscious choice to take two innocent lives. They pointed to evidence that suggested the killings were planned rather than impulsive, including Jacob's apparent decision to target specific family members while sparing others. Timothy Stockdale found himself in an impossible position during this period. He was grieving the loss of his wife and son while simultaneously watching his surviving son face potential life imprisonment for their murders. He had to confront the possibility that his parenting methods, which he had believed were creating strong, moral young men, had instead contributed to a tragedy that destroyed his family. The community's reaction was mixed and complex. Some residents who had known the family for years expressed shock and disbelief that such violence could emerge from what had appeared to be such a disciplined, religious household. Others admitted that they had always found something unsettling about the family's rigid control and isolation, though none had imagined it could lead to such devastation. The wife swap episode took on new significance as viewers and commentators revisited the family's television appearance with the knowledge of what had happened years later. The confrontations between Timothy and the visiting mother, which had once seemed like simple disagreements about parenting philosophy, now looked like warning signs of deeper dysfunction. Mental health professionals who studied the case pointed to it as an example of how extreme control and isolation can contribute to psychological breakdown. They noted that Jacob had been denied the normal developmental experiences that allow young people to gradually build independence and coping skills. Instead, he had been thrust into adult responsibilities without the emotional tools necessary to handle them. The surviving Stockdale brothers, Charles and Calvin, faced their own complex grief and guilt. They had escaped the family situation through various means, but they now had to live with the knowledge that their brother's desperation had reached a point where he saw no alternative to violence. They also had to confront their own feelings about their upbringing and the role it might have played in the tragedy. As Jacob's case moved through the legal system, more details emerged about his mental state in the months and weeks leading up to the killings. Friends and acquaintances who had encountered him during his attempts at independent living described a young man who seemed increasingly desperate and hopeless. He had spoken about feeling trapped, about believing that he could never succeed in the outside world but also could never accept permanent return to his childhood home. The plea negotiations were lengthy and complex. Jacob's attorneys argued for a sentence that would take his mental health issues and traumatic upbringing into account, while prosecutors sought justice for the two innocent victims. Eventually, Jacob accepted a plea agreement that would spare him the death penalty but ensure he would spend decades in prison for his crimes. In June 2018, exactly 1 year after the murders, Jacob Stockdale was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison for the killing of his mother and brother. The judge acknowledged the tragic circumstances that had contributed to the crimes while emphasizing that nothing could excuse the taking of innocent lives. During the sentencing hearing, Timothy Stockdale made a statement that revealed the depth of his own struggle to understand what had happened to his family. He spoke about his love for all his sons, including Jacob, and his desire to somehow find meaning in the tragedy. But he also had to confront the possibility that his rigid control and unrealistic expectations had played a role in creating the conditions that led to the violence. The Stockdale farmhouse, once a symbol of traditional family values, stood empty for months after the tragedy. Eventually, Timothy was forced to sell the property, unable to bear living in the place where his wife and son had died. The new owners renovated extensively, trying to erase the physical reminders of what had occurred there. The instruments that had once brought the Stockdale family together remained silent. The bluegrass and gospel music that had defined their public identity was forever associated with the tragedy that had ended their story. The family band that had once performed at county fairs and church gatherings existed now only in old recordings and faded memories. In the years that followed, the Stockdale case became a reference point for discussions about extreme parenting, mental health awareness, and the dangers of isolation. Child development experts used it as an example of how children need gradual exposure to independence and decision-making in order to develop into healthy adults. The tragedy also sparked conversations about reality television and its potential impact on families. Some critics argued that the wife swap appearance had contributed to the family's dysfunction by exposing their private conflicts to public scrutiny and potentially exacerbating existing tensions. But perhaps most importantly, the Stockdale case served as a reminder that appearances can be deceiving, that the most seemingly perfect families can conceal profound dysfunction, and that mental health issues require professional attention rather than simply stricter discipline or moral instruction. The story of the Stockdale family serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of extremism in any form, even when that extremism is motivated by seemingly positive intentions. Timothy Stockdale's desire to raise moral, disciplined children was not inherently problematic, but his methods were so rigid and controlling that they prevented his sons from developing the skills necessary for independent adult life. Mental health professionals who studied the case identified several warning signs that, if recognized and addressed, might have prevented the tragedy. Jacob's repeated failures at independent living, his increasing desperation and hopelessness, and his expressions of feeling trapped were all indicators that professional intervention was needed. The isolation that characterized the Stockdale family's lifestyle also contributed to the tragedy by preventing outside perspectives from identifying and addressing the growing dysfunction. Families that operate in complete isolation, without meaningful connections to broader communities, lack the external support systems that can help identify and address problems before they reach crisis points. The case also highlighted the importance of allowing children to gradually develop independence and decision-making skills. The Stockdale boys were expected to transition directly from complete dependence to full adult responsibility without the intermediate steps that most children experience. This lack of gradual preparation left them unprepared for the challenges of adult life. Educational experts pointed to the family's approach to homeschooling as another contributing factor. While homeschooling can be highly effective when done well, the Stockdale children's education was so narrow and controlled that it failed to prepare them for the diversity of perspectives and challenges they would encounter in the broader world. The tragedy also raised questions about the role of religious faith in family life. While many families successfully integrate strong religious beliefs with healthy child-rearing practices, the Stockdale case demonstrated how religious conviction can become problematic when it is used to justify excessive control and isolation. For Timothy Stockdale, the years following the tragedy have been marked by profound grief and soul-searching. He has had to confront the possibility that his well-intentioned efforts to protect and guide his children may have instead contributed to their destruction. This recognition has been devastating for a man who devoted his life to what he believed was the right way to raise children. The surviving Stockdale brothers have each had to find their own way forward in the aftermath of the tragedy. They carry the dual burden of grief for their lost family members and guilt about their own survival. They also must navigate adult life with the same limited preparation that contributed to Jacob's struggles, though they have had the benefit of professional support and therapy. Jacob Stockdale remains incarcerated, serving his sentence while grappling with the magnitude of his actions. Prison mental health professionals have worked with him to address the psychological issues that contributed to his crimes, but the damage done to his family can never be undone. The broader community of Beach City, Ohio, has also had to process the tragedy and its implications. A community that once held up the Stockdale family as an example of traditional value successfully lived has had to confront the reality that their admiration may have been misplaced. This recognition has led to broader conversations about the warning signs of family dysfunction and the importance of community support for struggling families. The case has also influenced discussions about reality television and its impact on participating families. While it's impossible to know whether the wife swap appearance directly contributed to the family's eventual tragedy, it certainly exposed existing tensions and may have exacerbated the pressure that was already building within the family structure. The story of the Stockdale family is ultimately a tragedy of good intentions gone terribly wrong. Timothy Stockdale's desire to raise moral, disciplined children who would be prepared for life's challenges was admirable in its intentions but devastating in its execution. His rigid control and extreme isolation created the very problems he was trying to prevent. The family that once stood as a symbol of traditional values and musical harmony became instead a cautionary tale about the dangers of extremism and the importance of mental health awareness. Their story reminds us that the most perfect-appearing facades can conceal the most profound dysfunction, and that the failure to address warning signs can have consequences that extend far beyond the individuals directly involved. For those who remember the Stockdale family from their wife swap appearance, the tragedy serves as a sobering reminder that reality television captures only brief moments in time, not the full complexity of family dynamics. The disciplined, harmonious family that appeared on screen in 2008 was already struggling with tensions and conflicts that would eventually prove destructive. The instruments that once brought the Stockdale family together in beautiful harmony now sit silent, their music forever associated with tragedy rather than joy. The farmhouse that once echoed with bluegrass melodies and family conversation stands empty, its walls holding memories too painful for those who survived to bear. But perhaps from this tragedy, some measure of good can emerge. The Stockdale case has contributed to important conversations about parenting, mental health, and community responsibility. It has reminded professionals and families alike of the importance of balance, of gradual independence, and of seeking help when problems arise. The story serves as a reminder that love alone is not enough to prevent tragedy, that good intentions must be balanced with wisdom, that protection must be balanced with preparation for independence, and that family loyalty must be balanced with individual mental health and well-being. As we reflect on the rise and fall of the Stockdale family, we are reminded of the fragility of human relationships and the importance of recognizing and addressing problems before they reach crisis points. Their story is a tragedy, but it is also a call to action, a reminder that communities, families, and individuals all have roles to play in preventing such devastating outcomes. In the quiet hills of Ohio, where the Stockdale farm once stood as a symbol of traditional family values, the wind now blows through empty fields and past a silent house. The music has stopped, the family has scattered, and the dream of perfect harmony has been replaced by the harsh reality of lives forever changed by violence. But somewhere in the silence, there may still be lessons to be learned, warning signs to be recognized, and future tragedies to be prevented. The Stockdale family's story has ended, but the conversations it has sparked about family, mental health, and community responsibility continue, offering hope that their tragedy might somehow contribute to preventing others. Please, if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Let me take you back to August 20, 1989, to a sprawling mansion nestled in the hills of Beverly Hills, California. The address was 722 North Elm Drive, a place where manicured lawns met marble floors, where success seemed to drip from every expensive fixture. This was the home of the Menendez family, a place that from the outside looked like the American dream incarnate. But as we'll discover tonight, beneath the veneer of wealth and success lay secrets so dark, so twisted, that they would ultimately tear this family apart in the most violent way imaginable. The story I'm about to tell you spans decades, weaving through tales of ambition, abuse, desperation, and murder. It's a story that captivated America in the 1990s, splitting public opinion down the middle and raising questions that still echo today. Some saw cold-blooded killers motivated by greed. Others saw victims of horrific abuse who finally snapped under unbearable pressure. The truth, as it often is in real life, was far more complex than either narrative allowed. So allow me to tell you the complete story of Lyle and Eric Menendez, two brothers whose names became synonymous with one of the most shocking family murders in American history. Our story begins not with the murders themselves, but with the man who would become the primary victim, José Enrique Menéndez. Born in Cuba in 1944, José embodied the classic American immigrant success story. His family fled Cuba when Fidel Castro rose to power, arriving in the United States with little more than hope and determination. José was just a teenager then, but he carried within him an iron will that would shape not only his own destiny but the fate of his entire family. José threw himself into his studies with the intensity of someone who understood that education was his ticket to a better life. He excelled academically, eventually earning an accounting degree from Queens College in New York. But José had bigger dreams than simply crunching numbers in some anonymous office. He had his sights set on the entertainment industry, specifically the music business, where fortunes could be made and power wielded with almost feudal authority. His ambition paid off. By the 1980s, José had clawed his way up the corporate ladder to become an executive at RCA Records, one of the most powerful music companies in the world. He wasn't just successful, he was phenomenally successful. His annual income soared into the hundreds of thousands, then beyond the $1 million mark. He had achieved the American dream, but like many who reach such heights, the cost of that success would prove to be higher than anyone could have imagined. In 1963, José married Mary Louise "Kitty" Anderson, a woman who seemed to complement his driven personality perfectly. Kitty was beautiful, well-educated, and came from a middle-class background that appreciated the finer things José could provide. She had her own ambitions too, dreams of becoming a teacher, of making a difference in young people's lives. But as José's career demanded more and more of his time and attention, Kitty found herself increasingly isolated in their world of wealth and privilege. The couple's first child, Joseph Lyle Menéndez, was born on January 10, 1968. From the moment he drew his first breath, Lyle was groomed to be José's successor, his heir apparent in both business and in life. José had specific ideas about how to raise a son in America. You pushed them hard, you demanded perfection, and you never accepted excuses. In José's mind, the world was a brutal, competitive place, and only the strongest survived. 2.5 years later, on November 27, 1970, Eric Galen Menéndez joined the family. Where Lyle was outgoing and confident, Eric was more sensitive, more introspective. But José applied the same rigorous standards to both his sons. They would be winners, he decided. They would be champions. Failure was not an option in the Menéndez household. The family lived well, very well. They moved from New York to New Jersey, then eventually to California, each move taking them to increasingly exclusive neighborhoods. The houses got bigger, the cars more expensive, the vacations more exotic. By the time they settled in Beverly Hills, the Menéndez family was living a lifestyle that most people could only dream of. But money, as the old saying goes, can't buy happiness. And it certainly can't buy peace of mind. Life in the Menéndez household was governed by José's exacting standards. He wasn't just demanding, he was relentless. Both Lyle and Eric were expected to excel at everything they touched. Tennis became a particular obsession for José. He saw it as the perfect sport for successful men, a way to network with other wealthy, powerful people while maintaining the physical fitness that José believed was essential to success. The boys were enrolled in tennis lessons from an early age, and their progress was monitored with the intensity of a military operation. José hired the best coaches money could buy. He studied their techniques, analyzed their games, and pushed them to achieve rankings that would open doors at the most prestigious universities in the country. Lyle, being older and naturally more aggressive, adapted to this pressure better than his younger brother. He developed into a skilled player, good enough to eventually play on Princeton University's tennis team. But for Eric, who was more sensitive and artistic by nature, the constant pressure was suffocating. He was talented too, but the weight of his father's expectations seemed to crush rather than motivate him. The pressure wasn't limited to sports. Academics were equally important in José's grand plan for his sons. They attended the best private schools money could buy, first Princeton Day School in New Jersey, then later Beverly Hills High School when the family moved to California. Their grades were scrutinized, their teachers consulted, their futures mapped out with military precision. But behind closed doors, according to what would later emerge in court testimony, something far darker was happening. The boys would eventually claim that Jose's control over their lives extended into areas that no father should ever venture. They alleged that the sexual abuse began when they were very young and continued for years, a horrific secret that they were too terrified and ashamed to reveal to anyone. Kitty, meanwhile, seemed to be struggling with her own demons. The woman who had once dreamed of teaching and making a difference in the world found herself increasingly dependent on alcohol and prescription medications. She became paranoid, suspicious, and emotionally unstable. Some who knew the family described her as being completely under Jose's control, while others saw her as an active participant in the dysfunction that was slowly consuming the Menendez household. The boys learned to present a perfect facade to the outside world. They were handsome, well-dressed, and articulate. They attended the right parties, dated the right girls, and said all the right things. But friends would later remember moments when the mask slipped, when Lyle would explode in sudden rage over seemingly minor incidents, or when Eric would disappear into himself, becoming distant and unreachable. As they entered their late teens and early 20s, both brothers began exhibiting troubling behaviors. Lyle was caught cheating on his SATs and later suspended from Princeton for plagiarism. Eric struggled with his tennis career despite his obvious talent, seeming to sabotage himself just when success was within reach. They both began engaging in petty criminal activities, burglaries of homes in wealthy neighborhoods, stealing cash and jewelry for reasons that had nothing to do with financial need. Looking back, these incidents seem like desperate cries for help, attempts to break free from the suffocating control of their father or to get his attention in any way possible. But at the time, Jose dealt with these problems the way he dealt with everything else, with an iron fist and absolute authority. There would be consequences, there would be punishment, and there would be no tolerance for weakness or failure. The family was a powder keg, and the fuse was burning shorter every day. By the summer of 1989, tensions in the Menendez household had reached a breaking point. Eric was 18, just graduated from high school, with a tennis career that showed promise but seemed to be stalling under the weight of his psychological struggles. Lyle was 21, having been suspended from Princeton and facing an uncertain future that definitely didn't meet his father's ambitious expectations. The brothers later claimed that around this time, Eric finally found the courage to confide in Lyle about the ongoing sexual abuse he was suffering at their father's hands. According to their testimony, this revelation led to a confrontation between Lyle and Jose that turned explosive. Jose allegedly threatened to kill both boys rather than allow them to expose him and destroy the empire he had built. Whether this version of events is true remains a matter of fierce debate to this day. What is undeniable is that something fundamental shifted in the family dynamics during those final weeks of summer. Friends and family members would later recall that both boys seemed different, more agitated, more desperate, as if they were trapped animals looking for any possible means of escape. The weekend of August 19 to 20, 1989, began like many others in the Menendez household. Jose was focused on business, Kitty was managing her various medications and dealing with her psychological issues, and the boys were supposedly making plans for their respective futures. It was a typical summer weekend in Beverly Hills, warm, sunny, and deceptively peaceful. On the evening of August 20th, Jose and Kitty settled in to watch a movie in their spacious family room. They had rented The Spy Who Loved Me, a James Bond film, and planned to spend a quiet evening at home. The house was large enough that the boys could easily be elsewhere without disturbing their parents, and indeed, that's exactly what everyone assumed had happened. What occurred next would shatter not only the Menendez family but would captivate and horrify the American public for years to come. The exact sequence of events on the night of August 20, 1989, would be debated in courtrooms and living rooms across America for decades. But the basic facts are these: Sometime around 10 p.m., Jose and Kitty Menendez were brutally murdered in their own home, killed by multiple shotgun blasts that were so devastating that their bodies were nearly unrecognizable. According to the story that Lyle and Eric would initially tell police, they had gone out that evening to see a movie at the Century City Mall and then to visit a friend. They claimed they returned home around 10:30 p.m. to find their parents' bodies in the family room. The scene was horrific. Jose had been shot multiple times, including a fatal shot to the back of his head. Kitty had initially survived the first shots and had tried to crawl away, but the killer or killers had followed her and finished the job with several more devastating blasts. The 911 call came in at 11:47 p.m. It was Lyle on the phone, and his voice was filled with panic and hysteria. "Someone killed my parents," he screamed into the phone. When police arrived, they found both brothers outside the house, appearing to be in complete shock. They were crying, they were incoherent, and they seemed genuinely traumatized by what they had discovered. The crime scene itself was horrific. The shotgun blasts had been fired at close range, suggesting this was personal rather than a random robbery gone wrong. Curiously, though, there were no signs of a struggle, no evidence that Jose, a strong, athletic man, had tried to fight off his attackers. It was as if he had been caught completely off guard, possibly by someone he trusted enough to let get close. The police investigation began immediately, but the initial focus was on Jose's business dealings. As a high-level executive in the entertainment industry, he had undoubtedly made enemies. The music business was notorious for its connections to organized crime, and investigators theorized that Jose might have been killed as part of some larger business dispute. This theory seemed to make sense initially. Jose was wealthy, powerful, and operated in an industry where violence was not unknown. The fact that nothing had been stolen from the house suggested that this wasn't a robbery. The brutal nature of the killing suggested a professional hit, or at least someone with a very personal motive for wanting Jose dead. But as the investigation progressed, attention gradually shifted to the two people who stood to inherit Jose's considerable fortune, his sons, Lyle and Eric. In the weeks and months following the murders, the behavior of the Menendez brothers began to raise eyebrows among both law enforcement and the Beverly Hills community. Rather than displaying the long-term grief one might expect from young men who had lost both parents in such a traumatic way, Lyle and Eric seemed to be adjusting to their new circumstances with remarkable speed. The spending began almost immediately. Within days of the funeral, both brothers were making purchases that seemed wildly inappropriate for people in mourning. Lyle bought a Porsche 911 Carrera, a watch that cost $15,000, and began looking at expensive real estate. Eric hired a full-time tennis coach for $60,000 a year and started traveling to tournaments around the country. Together, they spent hundreds of thousands of dollars in just the first few months after their parents' deaths. When questioned about these expenditures, the brothers had explanations that seemed reasonable on the surface. They claimed they were trying to cope with their grief by pursuing activities that their parents would have wanted them to pursue. The tennis coaching, in particular, was something Jose had always encouraged. The expensive purchases, they said, were their way of honoring their parents' memory by living the successful lives Jose had always envisioned for them. But to experienced investigators, the pattern was troubling. In their experience, people who had just lost loved ones to violent crime typically went through a period of shock and grief that made such extravagant spending emotionally impossible. The Menendez brothers seemed not just unaffected by their parents' deaths, but almost liberated by them. Other behaviors also raised red flags. Both brothers seemed remarkably composed when discussing the murders. They showed little emotion during police interviews and seemed more concerned with controlling the narrative than with helping to find their parents' killers. They hired attorneys almost immediately, which was their right but struck some as unusual for innocent family members who should have been eager to assist the investigation. Perhaps most significantly, investigators discovered that Jose had recently changed his will, and there were indications that he had been considering disinheriting both sons due to their recent behavioral problems. The brothers had hired a computer expert to delete files from Jose's computer after the murders, claiming they were trying to protect business secrets. But investigators suspected they were actually trying to destroy evidence of their father's plans to cut them out of his fortune. As 1989 turned into 1990, the case remained officially unsolved, but privately, detectives were becoming increasingly convinced that the answer to the murders lay not in José's business dealings but within the Menendez family itself. The break in the case came from an unexpected source, Dr. Jerome Oziel, a Beverly Hills psychologist who had been treating Eric Menendez. What happened in Dr. Oziel's office in the months following the murders would ultimately seal the fate of both brothers and provide the key evidence that prosecutors needed to bring them to trial. According to Dr. Oziel's later testimony, Eric had been struggling with overwhelming guilt and anxiety since the murders. During their sessions, Eric seemed to be wrestling with something he desperately wanted to confess but couldn't bring himself to reveal. Finally, in October 1989, the dam burst. Eric allegedly confessed to Dr. Oziel that he and Lyle had killed their parents. The confession, as Dr. Oziel later recounted it, was detailed and chilling. Eric claimed that he and Lyle had planned the murders carefully, purchasing shotguns and waiting for the right opportunity. He said they had killed José first, shooting him while he watched television, then turned the guns on Kitty when she tried to flee. The motive, according to Eric's confession, was a combination of years of abuse and the fear that José was about to disinherit them. Dr. Oziel found himself in an impossible position. Patient-doctor confidentiality normally would have prevented him from revealing what Eric had told him, but there were exceptions when the doctor believed the patient posed a continuing danger to others. When Lyle allegedly threatened Dr. Oziel's life after learning about Eric's confession, the psychologist decided he had no choice but to contact authorities. The confession was recorded on audio tape, though the tapes themselves would become a major point of legal contention in the years to come. Defense attorneys would argue that the confession had been coerced and that Dr. Oziel had manipulated his young patient into making incriminating statements. Prosecutors, naturally, saw the tapes as the smoking gun that proved the brothers' guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. On March 8, 1990, nearly 7 months after the murders, Lyle Menendez was arrested at the family's Beverly Hills mansion. The arrest was dramatic. Television crews captured footage of the handcuffed young man being led away by police, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. Eric, who was in Israel at the time playing in a tennis tournament, turned himself in to authorities 3 days later. The arrest sent shockwaves through Beverly Hills and the entertainment industry. Here were 2 young men from one of the community's most prominent families, accused of brutally murdering the parents who had given them every advantage in life. It seemed impossible, yet the evidence was mounting against them. Both brothers were charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. If convicted, they faced the death penalty. The case that had begun as a mysterious double homicide in Beverly Hills was about to become one of the most closely watched and controversial murder trials in American history. The first trial of the Menendez brothers began in 1993, and from the opening statements, it was clear that this would be unlike any murder trial America had ever seen. Court TV, a relatively new cable channel, decided to broadcast the proceedings live, bringing the drama directly into American living rooms every day. The decision to televise the trial transformed what might have been a local news story into a national obsession. Suddenly, everyone in America had an opinion about Lyle and Eric Menendez. The brothers were young, attractive, and articulate. They didn't look like the stereotypical image of cold-blooded killers. Yet they were accused of one of the most brutal family murders in recent memory. The prosecution's case was straightforward and seemingly devastating. They argued that the brothers had killed their parents out of pure greed, motivated by the desire to inherit José's multi-million-dollar fortune immediately rather than wait for him to die naturally. The spending spree that followed the murders, they contended, showed the brothers' true character. They were spoiled, entitled young men who had decided to take what they wanted rather than earn it. Prosecutor Pam Bozanik painted a picture of the brothers as calculating killers who had planned the murders carefully and then tried to cover their tracks with an elaborate deception. The shotgun blasts, she argued, were meant to make the murders look like a mob hit, deflecting suspicion away from the family. The brothers' apparent grief was nothing more than an elaborate performance designed to fool investigators and the public. But the defense strategy was unlike anything anyone had expected. Rather than simply denying that their clients had committed the murders, defense attorneys Leslie Abramson and Jill Lansing decided to acknowledge the killings while arguing that they had been committed in self-defense. The brothers, they claimed, had been the victims of horrific physical, emotional, and sexual abuse at the hands of both parents for their entire lives. This strategy was risky in the extreme. By admitting that Lyle and Eric had killed Jose and Kitty, the defense was essentially gambling everything on their ability to convince the jury that the abuse had been so severe that the brothers genuinely believed they were in imminent danger of being killed themselves. What followed was some of the most emotionally devastating testimony ever heard in an American courtroom. Both brothers took the stand and, over the course of several weeks, described in graphic detail the abuse they claimed to have suffered throughout their childhoods and into their adult lives. Eric's testimony was particularly harrowing. Speaking in a quiet voice that often broke with emotion, he described how the sexual abuse had begun when he was just 6 years old. He claimed that Jose had told him this was normal, that all fathers did this with their sons, and that he must never tell anyone or terrible things would happen to the family. According to Eric's testimony, the abuse escalated over the years, becoming more frequent and more violent. He described being raped repeatedly by his father, often in Jose's home office while his mother was elsewhere in the house. He claimed that Jose had threatened to kill him if he ever told anyone what was happening. Lyle's testimony was equally disturbing. He claimed that he too had been sexually abused by Jose, though he said the abuse had stopped when he was 8 years old and he had learned to fight back. According to Lyle, he had discovered that Eric was still being abused in the weeks before the murders, and when he confronted Jose about it, his father had threatened to kill both brothers rather than allow them to expose him. Both brothers also testified about their mother's role in the family dysfunction. They painted Kitty as an unstable, alcoholic woman who was emotionally abusive and who knew about Jose's sexual abuse but did nothing to stop it. In some instances, they claimed, she had actively participated in their emotional torment. The testimony was so graphic and so emotionally charged that several jurors were seen crying during the brothers' time on the stand. The defense brought in expert witnesses, psychologists and psychiatrists who testified about the long-term effects of childhood sexual abuse and how it could lead to the kind of explosive violence that had killed Jose and Kitty Menendez. These experts explained concepts that were relatively new to the general public at the time: post-traumatic stress disorder, learned helplessness, and the complex psychological dynamics of abusive families. They argued that the brothers had been so damaged by years of abuse that they genuinely believed their lives were in danger and that killing their parents was their only means of escape. The prosecution fought back with their own experts who argued that the brothers were manipulating the system, using claims of abuse to excuse what was really a calculated murder for financial gain. They pointed out that both brothers had continued to live in the family home and maintain relationships with their parents if the abuse was as severe as claimed. They also noted that there was very little corroborating evidence for the abuse allegations: no medical records, no reports to authorities, no contemporaneous accounts from friends or family members. The first trial was actually 2 trials, with separate juries for each brother due to certain pieces of evidence that could only be used against one or the other. This unusual arrangement meant that both legal teams had to present their cases twice, and it created the possibility for different outcomes for each brother. As the trials progressed through the summer and fall of 1993, public opinion was sharply divided. Some saw the brothers as cold-blooded killers who were cynically manipulating claims of abuse to escape justice for their crimes. Others saw them as victims who had finally been pushed too far by years of horrific treatment and had acted in desperation rather than malice. The media coverage was intense and often sensationalized. Talk shows featured daily discussions about the case, with guests debating everything from the brothers' credibility to the broader social implications of their abuse claims. The trial became a cultural phenomenon, with people across the country following every development as if it were a television drama rather than a real-life murder case. When the juries finally began deliberations in late 1993, many observers expected relatively quick verdicts. The evidence seemed clear-cut: either you believed the brothers' claims of abuse and accepted that they had acted in self-defense, or you believed the prosecution's argument that this was a cold-blooded murder for money. But the deliberations dragged on for weeks, with both juries apparently deeply divided. Reports emerged of heated arguments in the jury rooms, with some jurors convinced of the brothers' guilt and others equally convinced of their innocence. The complexity of the case, the combination of murder, abuse allegations, family dysfunction, and psychological testimony, made it difficult for jurors to reach a clear consensus. Finally, in January 1994, both juries announced that they were hopelessly deadlocked. Despite months of testimony and weeks of deliberation, neither jury could reach the unanimous verdict required for conviction in a capital case. The judge was forced to declare mistrials for both brothers. The outcome was unprecedented in a case of this magnitude. The prosecution had presented what seemed like overwhelming evidence of guilt, yet they had failed to convince even a single jury to convict. The defense had successfully raised enough doubt about the brothers' motives and mental state that substantial numbers of jurors were unwilling to send them to their deaths. But the deadlock also meant that the case was far from over. The prosecution immediately announced their intention to retry both brothers, and the legal process that had already consumed more than a year would begin all over again. The retrial of the Menendez brothers began in August 1995, nearly 6 years after the murders that had started it all. By this time, the media frenzy had died down somewhat, the O.J. Simpson trial was dominating headlines, and the public's attention had moved on to other sensational cases. But for the families involved and the legal teams who had invested so much in the case, the stakes remained as high as ever. The prosecution, led by David Kahn, made significant changes to their strategy for the second trial. They streamlined their case, focusing more narrowly on the evidence of premeditation and the brothers' behavior after the murders. Most importantly, they successfully argued for major restrictions on the defense's ability to present evidence of abuse. Judge Stanley Weisberg ruled that much of the detailed testimony about sexual abuse that had dominated the first trial would not be allowed in the retrial. The defense would still be permitted to argue that abuse had occurred, but they would not be able to present the graphic, emotionally charged testimony that had apparently swayed many jurors in the first trial. This ruling was devastating to the defense strategy. Without the ability to present detailed evidence of the alleged abuse, Leslie Abramson and her team were left trying to argue self-defense without being able to fully explain what the brothers claimed they were defending themselves against. The retrial also differed from the first trial in that only one jury heard the case against both brothers. This meant that any inconsistencies in their stories or strategies would be immediately apparent to the same group of jurors, making it harder for the defense to tailor their arguments to different audiences. The prosecution presented essentially the same case they had in the first trial, but with more focus and less of the circumstantial evidence that had cluttered their original presentation. They emphasized the brothers' spending after the murders, their apparent lack of genuine grief, and the careful planning that had gone into the killings. The defense did their best to work within the new restrictions, but it was clear that their hands had been severely tied by the judge's rulings. They were able to present some evidence of abuse, but nothing like the comprehensive picture they had painted in the first trial. Expert testimony about the psychological effects of abuse was limited, and the brothers themselves were restricted in what they could say about their experiences. Eric and Lyle both testified again, but their second appearances on the witness stand lacked the emotional impact of their first trial testimony. Without the ability to describe their alleged abuse in detail, their claims of self-defense seemed less credible and more like desperate attempts to excuse inexcusable crimes. The retrial moved much more quickly than the first trial, wrapping up in early 1996. When the jury began deliberations, there was a sense that this time, there would be a definitive resolution to the case that had captivated America for so many years. On March 20, 1996, after deliberating for less than a week, the jury returned with verdicts that would finally bring the Menendez case to a close. Both Lyle and Eric Menendez were found guilty of first-degree murder in the deaths of their parents. The jury also found them guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. The verdicts were a complete victory for the prosecution and a devastating defeat for the defense. Unlike the first trial, where substantial numbers of jurors had been convinced by the abuse allegations, this jury had rejected the brothers' claims entirely. They had concluded that Jose and Kitty Menendez had been murdered not by victims of abuse acting in self-defense, but by cold-blooded killers motivated by greed. The penalty phase of the trial began immediately, with the same jury now tasked with deciding whether the brothers should be sentenced to death or life in prison without the possibility of parole. This phase allowed for more extensive testimony about the brothers' backgrounds and characters, giving the defense one last chance to save their clients' lives. Family members testified on behalf of both brothers, describing them as loving sons and brothers who had been damaged by their upbringing but who deserved a chance at redemption. Mental health experts testified about the long-term effects of the abuse the brothers claimed to have suffered, arguing that even if the jury didn't believe the abuse justified the murders, it should be considered as a mitigating factor in sentencing. The prosecution argued that the brothers had forfeited any claim to mercy when they chose to brutally murder the parents who had given them every advantage in life. They emphasized the premeditated nature of the killings and the brothers' complete lack of remorse in the aftermath. After several days of deliberation, the jury announced that they could not reach a unanimous decision on the death penalty. Under California law, this meant that both brothers would automatically be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. On July 2, 1996, Judge Weisberg formally sentenced both Lyle and Eric Menendez to life without parole, bringing to an end one of the most controversial and closely watched murder cases in American history. The brothers, who had been 21 and 18 when they killed their parents, would spend the rest of their lives behind bars. The Menendez brothers were initially housed in separate prisons, a decision designed to prevent them from collaborating on any future appeals or schemes. Lyle was sent to Mule Creek State Prison in Northern California, while Eric was housed at Pleasant Valley State Prison in Central California. For the first time since their arrests, the brothers who had been inseparable throughout their legal ordeal were forced to face their fates alone. Prison life was a harsh adjustment for two young men who had grown up in extreme privilege. Gone were the luxury cars, expensive clothes, and unlimited spending money that had characterized their lives before the murders. In their place were cramped cells, prison uniforms, and the constant threat of violence that permeates any maximum security facility. Both brothers initially struggled with the transition. They were placed in protective custody due to the high-profile nature of their case and concerns about their safety among the general prison population. This meant spending 22 hours a day in their cells, with limited opportunities for exercise, education, or social interaction. Over time, however, both Lyle and Eric began to adapt to their new reality. They took advantage of educational programs available in the prison system, with Eric eventually earning a bachelor's degree in sociology through correspondence courses. Both brothers also became involved in various prison programs, including counseling other inmates and participating in support groups. Lyle married twice while in prison, first to Anna Erickson in 1996, and later to Rebecca Sneed in 2003 after his first marriage ended in divorce. Eric married Tammy Ruth Saccoman in 1999. These relationships, conducted entirely through letters, phone calls, and prison visits, provided some measure of emotional support for the brothers as they faced the prospect of spending the rest of their lives incarcerated. The brothers maintained their innocence in terms of their original claims about abuse, though they never again denied that they had killed their parents. In various interviews and statements over the years, they continued to insist that they had acted in self-defense, driven to violence by years of horrific treatment at the hands of Jose and Kitty Menendez. Their legal appeals continued for years, with various attorneys filing motions challenging different aspects of their convictions and sentences. Most of these appeals were unsuccessful, with courts consistently upholding both the verdicts and the life sentences. The justice system, it seemed, considered the case closed. While the Menendez brothers served their sentences in relative obscurity, their case continued to resonate in American culture. The trial had coincided with a growing national awareness of child abuse and its long-term effects, and many people continued to debate whether the brothers had been victims or perpetrators. The case became a touchstone in discussions about domestic violence, sexual abuse, and the criminal justice system's response to these issues. Legal scholars debated whether the restrictions placed on abuse testimony in the second trial had been appropriate, and whether the brothers had received a fair hearing of their claims. The emergence of social media in the 2000s gave new life to public interest in the case. Online forums and discussion groups debated every aspect of the murders and trials, with some people becoming convinced that the brothers had been wrongly convicted and others remaining certain of their guilt. Several books were written about the case, each offering different perspectives on what had really happened in the Menendez household. Some authors focused on the abuse allegations, arguing that the brothers had indeed been victims who had finally snapped under unbearable pressure. Others examined the evidence more skeptically, concluding that the abuse claims were fabrications designed to excuse inexcusable crimes. Television documentaries and true crime shows regularly revisited the case, often presenting new interviews with family members, legal experts, and others connected to the story. These programs helped keep public interest alive and introduce the case to new generations who had not followed the original trials. The case also became a reference point in other high-profile trials where abuse allegations were raised as a defense. Legal experts would often compare new cases to the Menendez trial, discussing what lessons could be learned from the brothers' conviction despite their abuse claims. For more than 2 decades after their conviction, it seemed as though the Menendez brothers' fate was sealed. They had exhausted most of their legal appeals, public interest in their case had waned, and they appeared destined to spend the rest of their lives in prison with little hope of ever proving their abuse allegations. But in 2023, nearly 3 decades after the murders, new evidence emerged that would once again thrust the Menendez case into the national spotlight. The discovery came from an unexpected source, a letter that Eric had written to his cousin Andy Cano in December 1988, 8 months before the murders occurred. The letter, which had been kept by Cano's family after his death in 2003, contained what appeared to be a contemporaneous account of the sexual abuse Eric claimed to have suffered at his father's hands. In the letter, Eric wrote about his fear of his father and alluded to ongoing abuse, providing the kind of corroborating evidence that had been largely absent during the original trials. "I never know when it's going to happen and it's driving me crazy," Eric had written to his cousin. "Every night I stay up thinking he might come in. I need to put it out of my mind. I know what you said before, but I'm afraid. You just don't know Dad like I do." The letter's discovery was significant because it predated the murders by 8 months, making it impossible for Eric to have fabricated the abuse claims after the fact as a legal defense strategy. If authentic, the letter provided strong support for the brothers' long-standing claims that they had been victims of ongoing sexual abuse. Around the same time, another piece of evidence emerged that corroborated the brothers' allegations. Roy Rossello, a former member of the Puerto Rican boy band Menudo, came forward with allegations that Jose Menendez had sexually abused him during the 1980s when Jose was an executive at RCA Records, which had signed Menudo to a recording contract. Rossello's allegations were particularly significant because they came from someone who had no connection to the Menendez family and no apparent motive to lie on behalf of the brothers. His claims suggested that Jose's alleged pattern of sexual abuse extended beyond his own family, supporting the brothers' long-standing assertions about their father's character. These new pieces of evidence prompted the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office to announce in May 2023 that they would review the Menendez case to determine whether the new evidence warranted reopening the brothers' convictions. It was the first time in nearly 3 decades that there had been any official reconsideration of the case. The announcement sparked renewed public interest in the story, with many people who had followed the original trials expressing hope that the brothers might finally receive the fair hearing they claimed to have been denied. Others remained skeptical, arguing that the new evidence, while interesting, was not sufficient to overturn murder convictions that had been upheld by multiple courts over the years. As the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office began their review of the new evidence, the case raised fundamental questions about the nature of justice and the possibility of redemption. The brothers had now spent nearly 3 decades in prison, longer than they had been alive when they committed the murders. They had missed their entire adult lives, watching from behind bars as the world changed around them. If the new evidence was credible, it suggested that the justice system had failed the brothers in their original trials by not allowing the full extent of their abuse allegations to be heard. The restrictions placed on abuse testimony in the second trial, which many legal experts had criticized at the time, looked even more problematic in light of the newly discovered letter and Rossello's allegations. But the case also raised difficult questions about the limits of self-defense claims and the point at which victims of abuse become responsible for their own actions. Even if José Menéndez had been guilty of the horrific abuse his sons claimed, did that justify the brutal shotgun murders that had ended not only his life but also that of Kitty Menéndez? The prosecution had always argued that regardless of any abuse that might have occurred, the brothers had other options available to them. They were adults, they had access to resources, and they could have left home, reported the abuse to authorities, or sought help in other ways. The decision to commit murder, prosecutors maintained, was a choice that crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The defense perspective, supported by expert testimony about the psychology of abuse victims, was that the brothers' ability to make rational choices had been severely compromised by years of trauma. They argued that the brothers genuinely believed they were in imminent danger and that killing their parents was their only means of survival. These competing narratives reflected broader societal debates about personal responsibility, the effects of childhood trauma, and the appropriate response of the criminal justice system to cases involving abuse victims. The Menéndez case had helped bring these issues into the public consciousness in the 1990s, and the potential reopening of the case promised to reignite these important discussions. As of late 2023, the review of the Menéndez case remained ongoing, with no definitive timeline for when a decision might be reached. The process was complicated by the age of the case, the need to authenticate the newly discovered evidence, and the complex legal questions surrounding whether new evidence could warrant overturning decades-old convictions. Legal experts noted that even if the new evidence was deemed credible and significant, it wouldn't automatically result in the brothers' release from prison. The most likely outcome, if the evidence was found to be compelling, would be a new trial or resentencing hearing where the abuse allegations could be more fully presented to a jury. Such a proceeding would face its own challenges. Many of the key witnesses from the original trials were now deceased, including Dr. Oziel, whose testimony about Eric's confession had been crucial to the prosecution's case. Physical evidence from the crime scene had been stored for decades, and questions would arise about its continued reliability and chain of custody. The brothers themselves had aged significantly during their time in prison. The young men who had been sentenced to life without parole in 1996 were now middle-aged, with gray hair and the weight of decades of incarceration evident in their faces. Their supporters argued that they had been model prisoners who had used their time productively, earning degrees and helping other inmates. Critics countered that good behavior in prison didn't erase the brutality of their crimes. Public opinion remained divided, just as it had been during the original trials. Social media platforms buzzed with debates about the case, with younger generations who had not lived through the original trials often expressing sympathy for the brothers based on their abuse claims. Older observers who remembered the media coverage from the 1990s were more likely to remain skeptical of the brothers' motives. The case had become a generational touchstone, with different age groups often reaching different conclusions about the brothers' guilt or innocence based on their own life experiences and changing social attitudes toward issues like domestic violence and sexual abuse. Regardless of how the current review of their case ultimately concludes, the story of Lyle and Eric Menéndez will remain one of the most compelling and controversial in the annals of American crime. It's a story that touches on some of the darkest aspects of human nature: family dysfunction, abuse, violence, and the complex relationship between victimization and responsibility. The case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice and the possibility of redemption. Can someone who commits a brutal murder ever truly be considered a victim? Is there a point at which past trauma excuses present violence? How do we balance our desire for justice with our understanding of the complex factors that can drive people to commit terrible acts? The Menendez brothers' story is also a reminder of how wealth and privilege can mask profound dysfunction and suffering. From the outside, the Menendez family appeared to have everything: success, money, beautiful homes, and bright futures. But beneath the surface lurked secrets so dark that they ultimately destroyed the family entirely. The case highlighted the prevalence of domestic violence and sexual abuse, issues that were less openly discussed when the brothers first went to trial in the 1990s. Their claims, whether true or false, helped spark important conversations about these topics and contributed to a greater societal awareness of the long-term effects of childhood trauma. For law enforcement and the legal system, the case provided important lessons about the investigation and prosecution of domestic violence cases. The initial focus on Jose's business dealings, while logical, delayed the investigation into the family dynamics that ultimately proved central to understanding the murders. The restrictions placed on abuse testimony in the second trial raised questions about how such evidence should be handled in future cases. The media coverage of the case also set important precedents for how high-profile trials would be covered in the age of cable television and, later, social media. The decision to broadcast the trial live brought unprecedented public attention to the proceedings but also raised questions about whether such coverage helped or hindered the pursuit of justice. Beyond the legal and social implications of the case lies the simple human tragedy at its heart. Two parents are dead, killed by their own children in their own home. Two sons have spent the majority of their lives in prison, cut off from normal human relationships and experiences. A family has been completely destroyed, with the surviving members left to grapple with guilt, grief, and unanswered questions. Jose and Kitty Menendez, whatever their flaws as parents, had their lives cut short in the most violent way imaginable. They never had the opportunity to see their sons mature, to experience grandchildren, or to enjoy the fruits of Jose's professional success in their later years. Their dreams and aspirations died with them on that August night in 1989. Lyle and Eric Menendez have paid an enormous price for their actions, regardless of what motivated them. They have spent their entire adult lives in prison, missing out on careers, marriages in the traditional sense, children, and all the normal milestones of adult life. If they were indeed victims of abuse, they have been punished not only by their abuser but by the justice system that was supposed to protect them. The extended family members who have taken sides in the case have also suffered. Those who supported the brothers have lived with the pain of believing that two young relatives were failed by both their parents and the justice system. Those who believed in the brothers' guilt have struggled with the knowledge that members of their own family were capable of such violence. The friends, neighbors, and community members who knew the family have been left to reconcile their memories of the Menendezes with the horrific reality of what happened in their home. Many have spoken over the years about the shock of learning that people they knew and liked could be involved in such a brutal crime. Even the legal professionals involved in the case have been affected by its intensity and duration. Several attorneys spent years of their careers on various aspects of the case, investing enormous amounts of time and emotional energy in pursuit of what they believed to be justice. The case became a defining professional experience for many of them. As we reach the end of this long and complex story, one thing becomes clear: the case of the Menendez brothers may never have a truly satisfying conclusion. Too much time has passed, too many questions remain unanswered, and too many people have been affected by the tragedy for there to be any simple resolution. The new evidence that emerged in 2023 has provided hope for those who believe the brothers were wrongly convicted, but it has also reopened old wounds for those who believe justice was properly served. The potential for a new legal proceeding offers the possibility of a different outcome, but it also means that the pain and controversy surrounding the case will continue for the families and communities involved. What we can say with certainty is that the story of Lyle and Eric Menendez serves as a powerful reminder of the complexity of human nature and the tragic consequences that can result when families are consumed by dysfunction and violence. Whether they were cold-blooded killers or desperate victims, the brothers' actions on that August night in 1989 changed countless lives forever. The case also stands as a testament to the importance of protecting children from abuse and providing support for those who have been victimized. Regardless of one's opinion about the brothers' guilt or innocence, their claims of abuse highlight the devastating effects that childhood trauma can have on developing minds and the potential for that trauma to lead to tragic outcomes. As the legal system continues to grapple with the new evidence in the case, and as society continues to evolve in its understanding of domestic violence and abuse, the story of the Menendez brothers will undoubtedly continue to generate discussion and debate. It remains one of the most compelling examples of how a single act of violence can reveal the hidden complexities of family life and force us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. In the end, perhaps that is the most important legacy of this tragic story, not the questions it answers, but the conversations it continues to provoke about justice, family, abuse, and the possibility of redemption. The Menendez brothers may spend the rest of their lives in prison, but their story will continue to live on, serving as both a cautionary tale and a catalyst for important discussions about some of society's most difficult issues. Whether justice has been served in this case may ultimately be a question that each person must answer for themselves, based on their own understanding of the evidence and their own beliefs about responsibility, forgiveness, and the possibility of rehabilitation. What cannot be disputed is that the case has left an indelible mark on American culture and continues to influence how we think about crime, punishment, and the complex dynamics of family life. The story of Lyle and Eric Menendez is, at its heart, a tragedy without winners, a reminder that some actions can never be undone and some wounds may never fully heal. As you drift off to sleep, perhaps you'll reflect on the complexities of this case and the broader questions it raises about human nature, justice, and the possibility of redemption in even the darkest of circumstances. As I bring this story to a close, it's worth noting that the Menendez case continues to evolve even today. The brothers remain incarcerated, now well into their 50s, having spent more than 3 decades behind bars. Their legal team continues to work on their behalf, hoping that the new evidence will finally provide them with the fair hearing they believe they were denied in their original trials. The case has found new life in the digital age, with podcasts, documentaries, and social media discussions introducing the story to generations who weren't alive during the original trials. These new audiences often bring fresh perspectives to the case, unencumbered by the media coverage and cultural attitudes that shaped public opinion in the 1990s. For those who knew the family personally, or who were involved in the investigation and trials, the ongoing attention to the case serves as a constant reminder of one of the most traumatic experiences of their lives. Some have embraced the opportunity to share their stories and perspectives, while others prefer to let the past remain in the past. The Menendez brothers themselves continue to maintain their innocence regarding the premeditation of their parents' murders, while acknowledging the deaths they caused. They have become advocates for other abuse victims within the prison system and have used their time to further their education and personal development. As this story ends and you prepare for sleep, remember that the questions raised by the Menendez case are questions that our society continues to grapple with today. How do we protect children from abuse? How do we balance justice with mercy? How do we help victims heal while still holding people accountable for their actions? These are not easy questions, and the case of Lyle and Eric Menendez doesn't provide easy answers. But it does remind us of the importance of listening to victims, investigating thoroughly, and never assuming that we fully understand the complexity of human behavior and motivation. The story of the Menendez brothers is ultimately a story about the human condition, about love and hatred, about family bonds and family betrayal, about the capacity for both great evil and great suffering within the same individuals. It's a story that continues to resonate because it touches on universal themes that affect us all, regardless of our background or circumstances. Sleep well, and may your dreams be more peaceful than the nightmares that have haunted the Menendez family for more than 3 decades. Tomorrow will bring new stories, new mysteries, and new opportunities to understand the complex world in which we live. But tonight, let this tale of tragedy and justice serve as a reminder of the importance of protecting those who cannot protect themselves and seeking truth even when it's uncomfortable or complicated. The story of Lyle and Eric Menendez may not be over, but for now, at least, this telling of their tale has reached its end. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.